Good afternoon, everyone on the East Coast, and I suppose still morning for those of you on the West Coast. Welcome to our next webinar in the Public Safety Innovation series of webinars. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Ari Vidali. I'm CEO and founder of Envisage Technologies, and I will be your host for today. Just a couple of housekeeping items before I introduce our speaker. First of all, our topic today will run approximately 1 hour, with about 35 to 40 minutes of presentation and about 20 to 25 minutes for our speaker to take your questions. Please feel free to enter any of your questions in the chat box that you should find in the lower left-hand corner of your screen. We'll be taking those and recording those for the end of the presentation. Also, we will be recording this. So we have your email addresses for those of you that registered, and after the presentation, we will be emailing you a link where you can download or access the recorded webinar. We encourage you to share this with anyone in your office or other colleagues who might have a need to hear the information that's presented. Before we get started, a little bit about us. Envisage Technologies is the leader in training and compliance technology for public safety professionals. In short, we ensure that our first responders are trained, equipped, and ready. With over 1.1 million first responders using our technology, we started this webinar series because, quite frankly, we were frustrated that really great ideas and best practices, those that can save lives, are not getting out there and being adopted fast enough. We're really passionate about solving that for public safety and raising the bar on training. We believe that readiness saves lives, and we're committed to improving public safety through awareness and innovation. Today's webinar is no exception. This is a topic of vital importance that is too often overlooked. A core responsibility of the leaders in the fire service is not only to understand the health hazards our firefighters face, but to aggressively mitigate them as efficiently and completely as possible. It is also the responsibility of each firefighter to protect themselves and the ones they love by minimizing their exposure to harmful chemicals and pathogens. Sadly, too many of our firefighters end up with major health problems during the course of their career. Our speaker today is dedicated to understanding the chemicals that are most dangerous to firefighters and to helping his brothers and sisters track their exposure. We are fortunate to have with us today Chief Clive Savacool. Clive has been in the fire service since 1996. His career has been in the San Francisco Bay Area, primarily with the Contra Costa County Fire Protection District, where he was one of the youngest chief officers in the history of the agency. Throughout his career, he's held many positions ranging from firefighter paramedic, engineer, captain, training chief, battalion chief, and vice president for the Firefighters Union. His fire service career was in a high call volume area where he was stationed at the busiest stations on engine, truck, and rescue companies. The busy call volume and years of toxic exposures took their toll, resulting in permanent respiratory damage. And in 2014, Clive left Contra Costa Fire District to improve his health and founded the program Exposure Tracker, which tracks toxic exposures, injuries, and communicable disease exposures for firefighters. The program has taken off and has already been adopted by hundreds of firefighters in a number of agencies. In February of 2014, Clive was given a board proclamation by the Contra Costa County Board of Supervisors for his work in the fire service. Through supportive organizations and other firefighters, Clive has dedicated his life to looking after the health and welfare of his brothers and sisters still in the fire service. And in the spring of this year, Clive put a badge and uniform back on as chief in Northern California. Clive, it's great to have you with us. We look forward to hearing to what you have to say.
All right, thank you, Ari, for the introduction, and thank you for letting me host this class here. The fire service has been part of my life since I was 18, and so I'm really happy to impart what I've picked up for the last couple decades. without further ado, we'll start with sort of addressing the agenda, and we're going to look at the current challenges we face in the fire service, what we can do to manage those risks, and then what best practices we've found. Okay, starting out, one of the unique things about our industry is it's not just a possibility of being exposed to carcinogens, it's an absolute. Every day we go to calls that expose us to known carcinogens. And so one of the things we're going to do today is look at why is this occurring? Why are we in such a crisis with cancer rates and other chronic illnesses? You can see from the types of cancers on the left, and this is information that's from the Firefighter Cancer Support Network's white paper that they put out. It's online. So we want to look at why is this being such a crisis and what can we do to address it. Okay, so for the current challenges, we're going to look at a various range. So we have cultural, which is a huge factor in our industry, what resources we have, and what the lack of awareness to the exposures, and then what chronic illnesses we have that we're exposed to. Okay, first off, we have just sort of the attitude in our industry. It just comes across as macho. It's been who we are as firefighters. We go into situations where they're life and death. We go into house fires where literally other people are dying, the residents or whomever, and we come out relatively unscathed. And so you do this over your career, and you feel like I'm bulletproof. Our gear protects us, our training protects us, and so for that incident, we're fine. But what we don't realize is that all these exposures have a chronic effect on us. And so if that day we feel okay, the next day we might be a little sore, might have some black snot. When we're taking a shower, we blow out, but it's all building up, and eventually it becomes too much for your body, and you start developing chronic illnesses. And the tough part about our job is there's no silver bullet to completely protect us from all these exposures, because inevitably we're going to go to fires. We're going to be exposed to carcinogens. And so one of the mentors and assistant chief I worked with at Contra Costa County, he told me if it's predictable, it's preventable. And so if we can predict that we're going to be exposed to these carcinogens, then what can we do to address it? And so addressing the sort of the macho attitude that we've got in our industry, and it's okay to be macho as long as we're still having that positive attitude about protecting ourselves. So tradition. It's important to recognize the tradition of our industry. It's what really brings us together, I think, in the camaraderie at our firehouses and our industry. And so tradition is huge, but what we can't do is just say it's part of the job when we go to fires and we just get these exposures. It's part of the job to have to deal with them, but it's not part of the job to work and overhaul without a mask on, or to have 30 turnouts and leave them that way for weeks. And so it's important to recognize tradition, but with all the information we have, there's no reason we can't start our own tradition of a new and healthier fire service. One of the reasons I picked this helmet image for this slide is I noticed one day I was sitting in my home office, I looked up a wall and I got one of my old leather helmets up on the wall, and it's just beat to hell. And I look at it, and I remember when I first mounted it years ago that I thought it was neat. It was sort of a record of my career. But now when I look at it and I see what it went through, it's like, man, it's no wonder I have permanent health issues. Everything that I was exposed to, it's no wonder that I've got the respiratory issues that I've got, because it's naive to think that these aren't going to be detrimental to us over time. Okay, learned helplessness. This is a term that really applies to our industry. What learned helplessness means is that if a person doesn't think that they're going to get any support, no matter what they do, they're not going to be able to move forward, then they don't try. They learn in a way that's detrimental to them because they never strive for improvement. They think that the chiefs won't support them, their captains or whomever won't support them if they want to have a more progressive approach to health and safety, so they just don't try. So that's one of the things that we really need to strive for with improving our industry. And really one of the key points to this is having a positive labor management relation. I know this is a little bit of a tangent, but coming from both union and administration, I recognize how well we work together collaboratively, and it had such a positive effect it had on the agencies. Following the crash of 2007, 2008, a lot of departments were forced to work together because they were just starving for funding. And so the departments that really did well after that were agencies that had strong labor management relations. And so that's where it starts with the leadership, and so it can overcome this learned helplessness that we get in our industry. So health and safety equipment. This is huge. We have a lot of resources out there for those of you that go to conferences. You walk through the exhibit halls, and you see all the new equipment, and you think, well, I could never afford that. Our department can't afford it. There's grants out there. The department I'm a chief at now is a combination department, and we're constantly working on 1 or 2 grants at a time. We just don't have very good funding. In fact, our budget is about 2/3. Our revenue is about 2/3 of our actual budget. So every year we're collecting other sources of income, revenue, to keep afloat and keep the department staffed with the best equipment and personnel. So don't just settle for, we have gear, but it's the best we're going to do. And this coat is the one I pulled off on our inventory and our supply at our department. You can see it was expired. It was manufactured in June of 2006, and so with a 10-year lifespan, this is expired. And we'll go through that a little bit more later, but turnout gear has significant degradation over time. So health and safety equipment is a big factor in preventing chronic illness and injury. Okay, so effects on exposure. Years ago, when I was doing my paramedic internship at the Berkeley Fire Department, one of the captains, he's now a chief officer, great guy, he told me, we're normal people put in abnormal situations. And this couldn't be more true for our industry. We go to these calls day in and day out, exposed to known carcinogens, and we think that because we have the title firefighter, that we're somehow immune, but we're not. We're normal people. And so even if we don't have an immediate reaction to these exposures, the call volume, the smoke, traumatic events, sleep deprivation, constantly lifting, these all have chronic effects on us. It's funny, but when I go back to the Bay Area and I was working there, if I wanted to run into another firefighter, I'd go to the chiropractor or my pulmonologist, and I would always see someone, maybe not from my department, but it was common to run into firefighters at the pulmonologist or chiropractor because that's it. Our back injuries and our respiratory illnesses are no accident. It's because of what we're exposed to. So just remember that we're normal people, and so we can't be naive to the exposures we're dealing with daily. So cancer. How many of you know somebody in the fire service, or maybe yourself, you've got cancer? It is common. I sat on a battalion chief's assessment center last week, and one of the raiders I was working with had he spent the last 4 years overcoming cancer, and it was just detrimental. It was horrible. And so it's a crisis in our industry. At one point I looked up how many firefighter funerals I'd been to, and it averaged out, I sat down one day, it averaged out to 1 a year. One firefighter died a year for every year I worked, and that's just from the department I worked in. Granted, a couple of them, they weren't from cancer, but nonetheless, this is a huge epidemic in our industry. One of the great resources we have for looking at cancer is there's a Boston Fire Department put together a video. It's only 8 minutes long. You can find it on YouTube, and it really puts into perspective what a crisis and what an epidemic cancer is in our industry. Another good resource you should all check out is there's a video called Toxic Hot Seat, and another video that also contributes. Another factor for cancer is not just our exposures, but the stress of our job. And there's a National Geographic's video called Portrait of a Killer, and it's only $2 on iTunes, I think, but it's also a great resource to show it's not just these carcinogens that are causing cancer in our industry. when you look at the stress we deal with, these traumatic calls, and the sleep deprivation, all these factors, all are contributors to cancer. And then how do we deal with it? We have times we have substance abuse issues, which, over abuse of alcohol also has cancer-causing effects. So huge epidemic in our industry, and we know it is, and so we need to address it. Okay, so respiratory. The one thing that I really want people to take home from this, not just this slide, but the whole webinar, is your quality of life. So one of the things that we take for granted is how much our quality of life is affected by some of these chronic illnesses. And from my personal experiences with the respiratory, it is just detrimental. And so one of the ways to put in perspective is, obviously you'll probably love your job as a firefighter. It's the best job in the world. Now imagine sitting in your doctor's office and having him or her tell you, you can't be a firefighter anymore. There's nothing more heartbreaking. And so just put yourself in that seat. And when you're in that seat, you're going to sit back. First off, you're being shocked. And you're going to sit back and think, God, what could I have done differently? And so just put yourself in those shoes. Think about your quality of life. And that's just on the job, not to mention how it's going to affect you with your family, your life. I basically can't live in anywhere with bad air quality anymore. I've got several apps on my phone to measure air quality. And so just having respiratory issues, it's just detrimental in so many ways. So I want you to think about the quality of life you'll have because of the exposure you take in this job. So cardiac. There's a great study done by the University of Illinois on the University of Illinois Fire Institute on how cardiac is affected from our industry. Now, there's a few things that we can't change as far as our risk factors, as far as age, heredity, race, and your gender. But we know that roughly 50% of all line of duty deaths are cardiac related. So you need to look at what can we do to prevent this. We can't just not go on calls. We can't not get up in the middle of the night to go to a fire and exert ourselves with heavy, exertion. So it's a factor we know we're going to have to deal with. So what can we do to change it? And so you want to be preventative with cardiac. You look at annual physicals, getting your cholesterol checked, hypertension, keeping your weight in check. Diabetes is a huge factor for cardiac emergencies. And then what are the other tangibles, like tobacco use? Our department is implementing a no tobacco use policy to help keep our guys healthy, not just for cardiac, but obviously cancer. And then another risk factor is physical inactivity. It's important to keep physically fit in our profession. So a lot of these risk factors are huge as far as these cardiac line of duty deaths. As an incident commander, it's important to make sure your folks are going to rehab, spending 20 minutes there. Get their vital signs checked when they arrive, 10 minutes, and then again at 20 minutes before they're released. And so all these factors can be addressed for cardiac. Okay, PTSD is getting a lot more attention in the last few years, thankfully. The International has done a lot of work. They came out with a great article last year that really started to address it. It was called Bringing PTSD Out of the Shadows. So the International has been great. In general, we take this for granted, especially early on in our careers. And I remember throughout my career, I'd be on calls and, whatever we were doing, cutting someone out of the car or a fire where there's fatalities or something. And I just remember thinking, this should be bothering me more than it is. And I couldn't figure it out at the time, just didn't know why certain things weren't bothering me. We'd go back to the station, we'd, finish dinner, we'd finish doing whatever we were doing. If it was night, I'd finish watching a movie or something right after we went on a horribly traumatic call that the normal population would have been shocked from. And so all these things add up. And so at the time you might think, hey, I don't know why, but this really doesn't bother me. It's just part of the job. But it builds up. And then you throw in sleep deprivation, the heavy exertion, this just normal stress of life, and things just mount up to where it's too much for us to handle. And when PTSD gets really bad, from my experience, what you see is a lot of times it's the peers that initiate getting help. We see our brothers and sisters having trouble, and there's warning signs. They call in sick more. They show up to work late. There's substance abuse issues, and you just see a general change in attitude, especially when you go on calls that you can hear from the dispatch often that what the nature of the call is, and you already kind of know how bad it's going to be. And so these individuals, you see them sort of just their behavior changes, their whole mood changes when they hear that they're being dispatched to this traumatic event because they want to avoid it because they know that it's bothering them. So PTSD is one of the things where we really can help one another out, pay attention. And even though most of us are not trained to treat someone for PTSD, there's a lot of resources out there. A lot of our departments have employee assistance programs. There's some nonprofits such as the Firefighter Behavioral Health Alliance that goes around. They teach courses. They also have some emergency numbers you can call. So there's a lot of resources out there to address PTSD. You don't have to be a therapist to be able to help one of your brothers or sisters. What's your job is to help keep yourself healthy and then to help watch your brothers and sisters for when you think they might be needing some help. But it's naive to think that all these traumatic calls aren't having an effect on us. Okay, so what can I do? And thankfully that's why you're here today, because you've recognized that this is a problem in our industry. So what can I do to change it? The biggest thing is to become that mechanism of change. We want to overcome that learned helplessness. And it doesn't matter what rank you are, what position you're in, you can help affect change in your department. Informal leaders have a huge influence within agencies. You don't have to be a captain or even higher. So first thing we'll look at are what are your agency's current practices? What are your policies? And there's a reason we differentiate these, because a lot of times we have policies that we don't follow. And policies hopefully they're not in place just because someone felt like writing something and memorializing on a paper. These policies are in place for a reason. And if they're not current, then change them. Most agencies have committees or ways to change policies, because in the fire service we're constantly seeing change with newer technology and best practices. So policies should be updated. So first thing you want to do is look at your department's policies and practices and keep them current, and then be accountable to them. As firefighters, take your role in there, and then captains, you should be leading by example. And on that note, we'll step into our roles and responsibilities. So firefighters, a lot of times firefighters feel that because maybe they're the lowest rank, they're not really going to have much influence. They're not going to have say in how the best practices is going to be addressed and how they can improve their department. When in all reality, there's a lot of things you can do as a firefighter. Oftentimes committees aren't rank specific, so you can come on committees and bring whatever information, research, ideas you've got to those. The other factor is, I found working as a union officer, is whoever works the hardest typically gets their way. I used to work harder when I was union vice president on drafting policies the way I wanted them, doing the most research, and because I could outwork the next guy on the other side, I knew that I was going to get the best for my firefighters. That's probably the reason my fire chief promoted me to battalion chief, is because he probably was tired of me fighting him, but then also wanted to have that kind of work ethic on the department, because on the senior staff, because he knew that I would help do what's best for the firefighters and do that hard work. So as a firefighter, you can do this. You can go out there, do the research, bring it to these committees, bring it to your officers, and then also by just following the best practices yourself, you're setting an example early on. Officers notice the firefighters that are taking those extra steps, doing their job as safe as they can. And believe it or not, when a captain, a battalion chief is on scene, they see those individuals, they know that that person's going to be just fine, and so they can focus on other things. And so as a firefighter, starting on your career, it's really important to follow these best practices. And a career goes by fast. Before you know it, you're going to be an officer. And so if you've already got that reputation, you're not going to promote to captain or lieutenant and be called a hypocrite, because you're going to have lived it. You're going to have led by an example from every rank you've been in. So firefighters, you have a huge ability and influence on improving your agency. So officers, one of the things that really comes with getting this badge is you're accepting responsibility. It's not just an accomplishment. Now you get to be in charge. It's you're now accepting responsibility. I remember lying in wake the first year as a captain at night, just thinking, okay, if we get a warehouse fire, what am I going to do? You know, all these different things I would run through my head because I just want to make sure that I was as prepared as I could be. The other thing that really helps for officers is to find a mentor, another captain, a battalion chief. It doesn't even have to be from your agency. You know, look for a mentor that you can bounce things off of to help you be better at it. If you're an administrator, have some sort of orientation. Have an officer's academy. When someone promotes, they're prepared. I remember when I made battalion chief, my orientation was they gave me a badge and some car keys. And so we can do better than that. We can set up captain's academies. We can get these folks prepared. The other thing is officers, it's our job to take ownership of these policies and procedures within our departments. When we work with our crews, we lead by example, and we show them the best practices and why we do what we do. And there's a great line from the movie Saving Private Ryan, gripes go up, not down. And so if you have concerns with a policy or practice, talk with your battalion chief, talk with your chief officers about improving things. But don't go back and complain to your firefighters. It creates distension within the agency, and it's like, excuse my pun, it's like cancer in the department because it really breeds this low morale and bad attitude. So officers, it's your job to lead by example, work hard, practice what you preach, you know, lead from the front, and then work with your administration if there's something that you don't think is perfect, isn't ideal. So now we come to the incident commanders. One of the things I noticed when I promoted battalion chief is how much we cut corners as firefighters. You know, we get on these fires, especially if there's someone trapped inside, and I've been there where you just tell yourself, well, it's worth the risk. I'm gonna go do things this way, and because there's so much to gain, I'm gonna take the risk. And we divert from our training, and we take these unnecessary risks and we cut corners. And this is the worst thing we can do. You know, we need to. That's one of the reasons training is so important. Is we build that muscle memory. We get into the situation sometimes where if crisis on calls, things don't go right, and mentally we're going to revert back to that muscle memory to address whatever challenge we're faced with. So it's important to do all your training, be proficient at it, and not cut corners when you're on calls. The other thing is that an incident commander is fire scenes are not a democracy. You are responsible for it. So you need to take charge and you need to make sure that people have what they need. Don't ask people to do things they can't do, and make sure that people are taken care of as far as rehab. If you need additional crews, call them. And then what's great is if you can send crews back. If you're on a fire for an extended period of time and you can bring more resources in, send home those first arriving crews if you can, so they can get decontaminated. They can get in the shower, they can rehab, and they can get all those toxins and carcinogens off their body. One of the things as an incident commander is if something does go wrong, something tragic happens, are you going to be able to look back and say, I did everything I could? Because if the tragic does occur and you didn't, you're going to, and even if you were prepared, if something really tragic happens, you're going to second guess yourself the day you die. And so it's extremely important to be on top of your game as incident commander. Something else important about this role is doing after-action reviews, doing a critique of the fire. So as a battalion chief, every fire I went to, I did a critique of it with my crews. And if it was, just a single alarm incident, we would have a critique there at the scene after it was knocked down, after the fire was out. If it was a major incident, we would set up a formal critique that we would then document and disperse to the rest of the department so they all could learn from our incident. There's always things that you could have done better at an incident. So it's really important to critique them, and it really helps develop your policies and your best practices. Okay, so now roles and responsibilities of administrators, training officers, and union officers. And the reason I included union and association officers in here is because even though technically they don't necessarily have authority in the department, there's a huge influence. Firefighters, especially young firefighters, will look up to their union officers as sort of their guiding attitude. You know, if you have that department where the union officers and administration are constantly battling, it breeds distrust with your lower ranks, with the firefighters in their administration. So one of the things I always worked on as a union officer and as administrator is you never air your dirty laundry in public. You work with your union officers or your administrators. You iron things out behind closed doors so that when you're in public, when you're in front of your personnel, you're creating a positive attitude. If there's some challenges you can't agree on, you know, come out with a good resolution for the message to the members. You want to have a really strong leadership in your department, and that comes from all these positions to help your personnel follow the best practices. Because if you've got a low morale, then that has an indirect effect on everything else in the department. And then training officers, of course, you're the ones that are making sure that everyone's following best practices. You're getting the best information out to your personnel. I loved working in training. It was a place where you could be creative. I remember talking to chiefs from other departments that were given the training chief job, and they couldn't wait to get back on the line as battalion chiefs. And granted, that's fun, but it was just so much fun being a training officer because of the freedoms and creativity to find out what the best practices are, what's current out there, what can you give to your personnel to get them excited about their job. Okay, so then at the fire station, this is another area where tradition has kind of given us some bad habits. I remember when I started, we would keep our bunkers right next to our bed. So as soon as the call went off in the middle of the night, we'd step right into our boots, pull our pants up, and head out the door. And that the whole time, all that gear was just off-gassing into the station. So departments should adopt policy of no turnouts in the fire station. On top of the off-gassing, you know, we go on medical calls or we're stepping through things that we don't want in the station, where we're cooking, where we're living. Our turnout gear should be treated like contaminated medical equipment. You know, imagine wearing a medical gown on a call and then keeping that medical gown on for the rest of your shift, walking through the station with that medical gown on that you had on this bloody call. You're cooking dinner with that medical gown on. You know, think about that in relation to your turnouts. And a lot of times we go on these medicals, we wear these gloves, and we're done, we throw them away, obviously. But in reality, the contaminants that we're getting on our turnouts and our PPE is known carcinogens, whereas the medical, it might have been exposed to some sort of communicable disease, maybe, versus the turnout gear where we know for sure it was exposed to something that causes cancer. So it's important to treat it accordingly. So keep the turnout gear out of the station. Another big factor that we've had at fire stations for years is we keep a lot of our workout equipment in the apparatus room. For years at the station I spent most of my career at, we were just working out right next to the engine. Later on, we ended up having a room built just for the workout equipment, so we sectioned off the apparatus room. But all that time, we're sitting there breathing in these diesel particulates that's a known carcinogen. Again, it's things that we know cause cancer, and we keep it in air. We sit there and exercise next to it. In my current department, we've made a policy of no sweeping in the apparatus room. Even though in California we've got a drought going on, it's better than getting cancer. And so the guys will hose out the apparatus bays and then squeegee them. That way we're not aerating all this dust. If you're not allowed to do that in your department, that's unfortunate. Or if you just can't, hose it out. Make sure you've got a mask on and decontaminate it accordingly afterwards. Because as soon as you start sweeping, you're aerating all these known carcinogens. Another great improvement for fire stations are exhaust collection systems. There's been a lot of grants out there that can outfit your department. You hook up the exhaust when you back into the station or you pull through, and it keeps all that carcinogen to a minimum. There are other best practices. Departments that have drive-through apparatus bays, open both doors when you pull in. You know, we've got remotes. Open the front and the rear door so that you can get air coming through to immediately blow those exhaust fumes out. Okay, PPE. This is a big factor, especially with some of these lower-funded departments, because they feel like it's a mountain they just can't climb. They can't get the best gear. And there was a study done years ago by the University of Kentucky on PPE and turnout specifically and their degradation over time. And it showed how after 10 years, what a high failure rate there was, especially of the outer shell of our turnout gear. And not just the tearing, but it had such a limited protection that the firefighters wearing that gear are being exposed to higher heat than otherwise. The vapor barriers tended to stay intact longer than the shell, but the shell themselves meant that the firefighters are getting a lot hotter, which we saw earlier increases your rate of absorption. It increases the heart rate. It gets you dehydrated quicker, and it basically affects your overall strength because your fatigue has been decreased. You've just been fatigued from all that heat. So it's important to make sure that your PPE is well taken care of and that you've got the best you can. Okay, so coming back to training, we have policy development. Talked about that earlier. The training divisions, this is where you really can hone in on that. This is your job to make sure that you have the best policies in place. Physical fitness, I can't emphasize this enough. Your department should have a physical fitness policy. When I first started at this department I work for now, they weren't allowed to work out before 5 p.m., and so we quickly changed that, made sure that the guys could exercise at whatever point in the day they wanted to. So you really need to have physical fitness is a top priority. And from an administrator's perspective, this physical fitness has an impact on your workers' comp. So aside from keeping your personnel healthier, your workers' comp rates can decrease because you've got a healthier workforce. Accountability. Oftentimes accountability is perceived as a bad thing. We think that Dad's going to get mad at us. But in all reality, accountability it's a really good thing. There's a department out here in California in the Central Valley that has some of the highest standards I've ever seen, and they have extremely high call volume. And I've never seen more pride in the department. These guys, they have the most pride in their department. They work very hard and they hold each other accountable, not in a way that they chew one another out if they're not doing it right, but they help raise the bar. They help, if they see a deficiency, they address it. They get that person back up to speed. So accountability is a very good thing. And then we talk about setting goals. Goals constantly help you raise the bar. And by nature, a lot of us are competitive in the fire service. So if you're working hard, you're setting goals, other crews, other stations around you are going to see this, and it's going to really have a positive effect on your department overall. Okay, so while on calls, we mentioned rehab earlier. One of the things you should have in rehab are these little towelettes, baby wipes. If you go to conferences, you'll see a lot of handouts. They'll have handouts like this one I have in the photo. And so you can decontaminate your personnel. And so while they're drinking water in rehab, give them these towel wipes to just wipe off their skin. Because think about it, while you're in this fire, all that carcinogenic material is being burned or baked into your skin. I'm sure you've noticed after calls a few days later, sometimes you still smell. I remember coming home years ago, and the day after a shift, and my girlfriend would tell me that she could tell I'd been to a structure fire or a fire because I was off-gassing it. And if I'm off-gassing it, it means that it's in my blood. So you want to stop those secondary exposures as soon as you can. I've heard some conflicting reports on it, but one department would use a blower. And so as firefighters would come out of a fire, they would stand in front of a blower to blow off all those particulates before they took their mask off. Now, some turnout manufacturers says that pushes the contaminants into the gear, so the research isn't totally done on that. But it's just an example of looking at ways to be proactive to get those contaminants off the skin. The other thing is you want to decontaminate our apparatus. When after a call, you put your gear into a compartment. I remember coming into work years ago, and I could tell when I started putting my gear onto the engine, sometimes I'd get that odor and be like, oh, they had a car fire last night, or they had a structure fire yesterday. You could tell by the smell, which is a bad thing. We shouldn't be smelling that in a vehicle when you're riding around in half the day. So not just your gear, but you want to decontaminate breathing apparatus as well. So again, after calls, this is where we're going to talk about when you get back to the station. So again, we know we've had known carcinogens baked into our skin. And a lot of times we'll come back from a fire, and it's fun to kind of, fires are a big accomplishment at times, especially when they go great and you come back to the station, you're putting the engine or the truck back together. If it's an early morning fire, maybe you got coffee on. And so it's fun just hanging out with everyone and putting things back together and kind of collecting yourselves and talking about the call. But it's really important that you shower as soon as you get back. If you can, get the engine in service or the truck in service as quick as you can, but set a timer. And this is where officers, your job comes into play, making sure you shower within an hour of leaving the call. Get back to the station, get cleaned up. That battalion chief I mentioned that just got through 4 years of dealing with cancer, he does what he calls a double scrub shower after fires. He'll go in there and essentially take 2 showers worth of scrubbing because he wants to get all of that off his skin. If the next day you still smell like that fire, then maybe you could have done better at decontaminating afterwards. One of the chiefs I've been working with, he's up in the Ottawa Fire Department, Chief Pete McBride. He put together what he calls a industrial hygiene policy. He doesn't call it decontamination, he calls it industrial hygiene. And what he does, he got a thick policy the department very, very strictly abides to, and they have improved their health and safety department. And so one of the practices, and that it talks about the PPE, is after the fire, wearing a mask, they'll take off their PPE, they'll put it into a clear plastic bag, tie it up, put it in a compartment. When they get back to the station, they take that bag, put it into the extractor, either tear it open or cut it open, and they'll pull the bag out of the extractor with gloved hands, close the door, and turn it on. And so they treat their PPE as though it's this radioactive material, just because it has carcinogenic material on it. And so they treat it accordingly, and it's greatly improved their department. And so it's really important to have the best care you can with decontaminating. Next, we'll move on to exposure tracking, obviously near and dear to me. I started out doing exposure tracking by just taking the run sheet after a call, writing my personnel's name on it, who was on the fire with me, and then I would stick it into a manila envelope. And so now I've got a stack of these envelopes in my garage, which is better than nothing, but really there's better solutions out there. There's several online programs you can use to track your exposures. Some of them have analytics, so you can see overall your exposures. You can see your department-wide exposures. So there's better resources out there, and it's never too late. That's one of the challenges. Is some firefighters think it's too late to start tracking your exposures, and it's never too late. I'm not sure how many of you have had the unfortunate experience of having to go through logbooks to track fires when one of your folks gets cancer, and you have to prove it. You have to prove that it is an industrial injury, it's job-related. Even here in California, where we have presumptive laws, there still is somewhat of a burden to prove that it was a job-related cancer. So having some sort of mechanism to track exposures is critical. I can tell you there's nothing worse than sitting with a widow going through logbooks to try and get all this information so she can get the death benefits. So ideally, we prevent it from occurring in the first place, but have some sort of mechanism to track your exposures. Okay, so we talk about always striving to improve. We go back, we talked about the training officers, the officers, even the firefighter rank of doing the best they can to improve, critiquing every fire. It's important to have education tracks in your department. In California, we have the California State Fire Marshal's education track where we get certified. And so it's great to have those courses and those available within your department to help keep people always constantly striving to improve. Go to conferences. At these conferences, you'll get a lot of new best practices. You'll also meet a lot of people that might be proactive as well as improving their department. Take classes. There's a lot of leadership courses out there. I've helped a good friend of mine up in the Sacramento area, is a battalion chief, Anthony Castro's. He puts on some great leadership courses, and I still keep in touch with some people I've met in his classes. There's a lot of great people you meet at these courses who are also very motivated, and so you can bounce things off one another. no matter where you are in the country, because they've always got this attitude of wanting to improve. So it's very important. And then, of course, career development. As chief officers, I mentioned having some sort of academy for officers. This really helps keep people motivated, keep them proactive, and then they impart that to their crews. And then finally, we have exposure tracking, as I just kind of beat to death in the last slide. Make sure that you monitor these exposures with the software that does have the data and analytics. You might be able to see, hey, maybe I've been exposed too much this year in a short time period. I should maybe look at a slower station, or maybe there's a training officer position I could take for a period. Don't be naive and wait for a chronic illness to appear. Be proactive. Like I mentioned before, this is a crisis within our industry, so take steps to address it. If it's predictable, it's preventable. So towards the end, I just want to say there's some resources out there. I mentioned earlier the Firefighter Behavioral Health Alliance. The Firefighter Cancer Support Network's got a lot of divisions throughout the country that can help you. Everyone goes home. There's a lot of different resources online that are available. Take advantage of them. If you don't have it internally in your department, if you're a union officer, a lot of these entities are very, very supportive for unions. And then, of course, administrations, great resources. So take advantage of the internet. If you don't have stuff internally, bring them back to your department. And then I just want to thank some of the partners I've worked with in the past, the Firefighter Behavioral Health Alliance, the San Francisco Firefighters Cancer Prevention Foundation. They're doing a great study right now, the Women's Firefighter Biomonitoring Collaborative, because women in the fire service, they get cancer at a faster rate than men. And so in San Francisco, they're doing a great job with the study, trying to figure out why. The whole reason we're here is why are we having this crisis? And so we really want to applaud San Francisco for the work they're doing. All right.
Thank you so much, Chief Savacool. That was really important information. I hope that everyone who's on this webinar will share this, because the goal is to start to really turn down the curve on the number of chronic illnesses that we see in the fire service. And if we take these proactive steps, perhaps collectively we can help to do that. We'd like to start answering questions now from the audience at this point. So as a reminder, please type any of your questions in the lower left-hand corner. We've got several here already, so I'll get started with the Q&A portion. One question, Chief, that we got was for decontaminating turnouts, is there an alternative to using the fancy extractors?
It's a good question. Those extractors are very expensive, obviously. The manufacturers often don't recommend washing by hand, but they also strictly tell you not to take them home and put them in your washing machine. You also don't want to go to a laundromat and expose other people's clothes to these carcinogens. But if you look up NFPA 1851, there's a lot of good information there on different steps you can take to wash turnout gear. I believe in the NFPA 1851, there's even certain chemicals they list, cleaning agents, on how to clean turnout gear and PPE. Yes, there are solutions to the fancy extractors. And I'm not sure, there might be grants out there specifically for that. I know some assistance to firefighter grants are somewhat non-discretionary for equipment like that. But NFPA 1851 is the best source for information on decontaminating turnout gear.
Thank you, Chief. Another question. One of our participants says, thank you for discussing PTSD in the fire service. Can you talk more about your department's policy regarding PTSD and how you identify issues in your crew?
So my previous department, Contra Costa, has started essentially a team, personnel that stepped forward to be the team to help get information out there to help address it. Because I'll be honest, in almost I first started there in '96 as a reserve firefighter, and the whole time, my whole career there, I had one critical incident stress debriefing. And I'm not pointing fingers. It was just the sort of the attitude of the times. And so since I've left in 2014, they've developed a policy and a team for addressing these issues. My current department, I started in May. We're just now getting a PTSD and mental health policy in place, so we're still developing it. But it all starts with the officers. After an incident, and I'll use one example, is we had a fatal car accident a few weeks ago, and we had a new firefighter, and I think it was the first time he'd even seen a fatality of any kind. And so the captain, after the call, talked with him, and then I asked the captain, I said, hey, later tonight, can you check on him? And then before he leaves in the morning, can you talk with him? So I don't have information on a specific policy. There's some follow-up contact information after this, and I can send over some resources. But I can tell you it starts with just being on top of it on a daily basis. Have the officers address it when it happens, do critical incident stress debriefings, and then watch for those warning signs that I mentioned earlier. As far as a black and white policy on it, that's a little tougher, but the Firefighter Behavioral Health Alliance also can have information on that, and they're online.
Thank you, Chief. Another question here. If your call volume is pretty slow, how significant are the exposures since there's so few?
That's a good question. And a good example of why every call makes a difference is actually two examples. One is that we had a freight train fire. It was actually before I got hired. So it was back in probably the mid to early 90s. And a number of people from that fire died of pancreatic cancer. And so just that one call, they were exposed to something that triggered pancreatic cancer in them. So regardless of your call volume, you're being exposed to something on each one of these calls that could be extremely detrimental. And that's one of the reasons that when you do exposure tracking, to make sure you document who else was with you. So if somebody else gets cancer or chronic illness, or if you do, you can help educate others, like make them aware that, hey, maybe we went to something on this call that's causing this illness. So even with a slow call volume, you're still being exposed to something that can cause a chronic illness. So call volume, I don't want to say it's irrelevant. There are some studies that say the number of fires you go to has a linear relationship to lung cancer. But in general, just being exposed, period, is detrimental.
Thank you, sir. How do you make sure training is as safe as possible in terms of chemical exposure, but also mimics real-life fires?
That's a tough one, and I'll use an example. Is when I was a union officer, our department was using a flashover simulator where we would burn OSB, and the OSB is this, the press board, like plywood, but it's used with like formaldehyde glues. And so some of our folks were getting sick, and they were just not feeling well after these training exercises. And so it was a challenge because as a union officer, I was questioning the health and safety. But at the same time, your personnel the backlash I got was, well, hey, it's part of the job. This training is very, very good. And it was great training, but you have to look at the risk factors. And so what we did is we looked at, okay, what can we do to help simulate the same real life effects of a fire? And so we looked at using pallets or other types of Class A combustibles that didn't have these toxic chemicals in them. And I'll be honest, it's not going to be as good, because the whole reason they use these glues and this wood and use them for the fires is because it gave a better flashover simulation. But the risk factor was just too high. Think about it as an administrator. If in 10 years, half these guys that you put through this training develop, a certain type of cancer, you failed as a leader. And so you have to find that balance of what's good training, but what's not going to be too dangerous to my personnel. And so it's a tough one to give a good absolute solution to. It's sort of, I just look at each and every scenario and just do some research. I mean, all live fires should have an incident action plan. And so when you put together that incident action plan, do a good analysis of what your folks are being exposed to. And then document it as well, just like it was a normal fire that you were exposed to.
That's very interesting, Chief. I've got another question here. What should a firefighter do if they actually come down with some kind of chronic illness?
So get support first off. You know, talk to your union officers. If you're volunteer department, just talk to a chief officer. Actually, all departments, you should have some sort of personnel officer or communicable disease, or infection control officer that might be able to help. But ultimately, it's your risk management department that's going to get you the treatment. Depending on what state you're in, the presumptive laws may or may not apply to you. In California, we have some pretty good cancer presumptive laws. I believe Utah just put some into place, but it only applies to, I believe, 4 different cancers, I believe. And then a side note on that is a lot of these presumptive laws, if you use tobacco products, it makes it so the presumptive law doesn't apply to you. So basically these laws say we'll cover you for cancer, but not if you smoke or use tobacco. So another big reason not to use tobacco. So the other thing is, after you do come down with illness, it's important to get treatment right away. Get the ball rolling, get some peer support from someone within your agency. Hopefully your union's got some experience with this. If they don't, neighboring agencies will. We talked about the Firefighter Cancer Support Network. They have people throughout the country who've dealt with this on a daily basis. And so there's a lot of great resources out there. And it's important to get the ball rolling as soon as you can.
Thank you, Chief. I've got another one here. This person says, I'm interested in bringing attention to exposure risk to the agencies in my area. Do you have any suggestions for the best way to approach this? So the county I work in now is El Dorado County in California, and we have a county-wide training officers association. And so if you have some sort of communication with a specific entity within neighboring departments, training officers are a great way to start. But there's some way you can collaborate to go through this. And you know, you don't want to over-committee it. You know, there's that old saying that a camel is a horse built by a committee. But what you want to have is just some good common communication. So when you do have these exposure risk factors, you want to get together collectively and share that. So look for other training officers and other departments. That's where I would start. And then when you're on calls, the county I work in now, we've got a lot of different departments with just a couple fire stations, but we run together daily. And so when you see these departments on calls, you know, talk with them after the incident. You know, share this information. When we have fires at our agencies, we do critiques together. And so use those daily interactions for sort of the way to get the ball rolling, but then find training officers in those neighboring agencies to collectively move forward with these exposure risks. And with some of the links in the follow-up emails after the webinar, there'll be contact information for me, and I can send out some more exposure information. Okay, that's all the time we have today. I'd like to thank you, Chief, for providing your perspective and sharing this really valuable experience with all of us. I'd like to also thank all of the participants for attending. We have recorded this webinar, and we're going to be sending it out in the coming days so that each of you can share it, and I hope that you share it widely. In addition, you are going to receive a survey following the event. I hope that each of you can take just a moment to fill it out. We want to hear from you about future topics you would like us to cover. That's it for this webinar. We hope to see you in the future, and have a great afternoon.